The door opened inward. Cold air hit Edna Marsh like a wall. Even though she was already inside it already, part of it had been part of it for hours. The stove in the corner was dark. Not banked, not low. Dark. The iron had gone cold sometime while she slept, and the cabin had been bleeding warmth into the January night, ever since 1 degree at a time, steady and patient and indifferent to everything that depended on it. The thermometer near the door read 34 degrees. Outside, the storm was still moving. She could hear it the way you hear something large and purposeful, not random wind, but intention, 70 miles an hour coming off the divide and finding every crack in every wall and pressing through with the particular determination of cold that has traveled 1,000 miles and is not finished yet. Nettie was on the sleeping platform with every blanket they owned pulled over her small body. She was 9 years old, and she was shaking in her sleep the way children shake when the cold has been working on them long enough to get past the surface and into the muscle. Edna stood in the dark cabin and looked at the cold stove. Her hands would not close properly. They had not closed properly for 2 days. She reached for the matches on the shelf above the firebox and knocked the box sideways and heard the matches scatter across the dirt floor. And she got down on her knees in the dark and found them one by touch, and by the time she had enough to strike one, her hands were shaking so badly that the first match broke against the striker, and the second one flared and died in a draft from the door gap, and the third one caught, and she held it with both hands cupped around the flame like it was the only warm thing left in Colorado, which at that moment it nearly was. The kindling caught, then the brush. She fed the firebox and watched the iron begin to tick as it expanded and pressed her palm flat against the floorboards beside the stove and felt nothing. The boards were cold. The channels beneath them were cold. The stone she had carried and set and mortared with her own hands through the worst weeks of her life had discharged completely while she slept, and it would take hours to bring it back. She wrapped herself around Nettie on the platform and held her and waited. 34 degrees, then 36, then 38. She had come a long way for this floor. She had come from Ohio with $12 and a dead man's deed and a granddaughter, and the particular kind of determination that looks from the outside almost exactly like stubbornness, and from the inside feels nothing like either one. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This story begins in August. Edna Marsh was 64 years old in the summer of 1893, and she had the hands of a woman who had spent 4 decades doing what needed doing without asking twice whether it was convenient. Her husband Gideon had died of typhus in a Denver boarding house in the spring of 1891, 2 years before this story finds her. He had been a practical man with a persistent dream, which is a combination that produces paperwork more reliably than results. And the paperwork he left behind included a filed homestead claim on 40 acres of mountain land in the Colorado high country, 7,000 feet above sea level, in a valley the settlers called Elk Creek. The claim required proving up. Under the terms of the Homestead Act, a claimant had to demonstrate continuous improvement in habitation over 5 years. Gideon had filed in 1891. 2 years had passed, 3 remained. If no one went to that land and worked it and lived on it, the claim would lapse and the 40 acres would revert to open territory, and everything Gideon had staked his last years on would simply dissolve back into the mountain like snow in April. Edna had no other land. She had no other money beyond the $12 she kept in a sock beneath the floorboards of a rented room in Columbus. She had Nettie, her son's daughter, orphaned at 7 when her parents died of fever within a week of each other, now 9 and serious-faced and accustomed to sleeping in whatever room was available. She had no reason to go to Colorado and every reason to go to Colorado, and on a Tuesday morning in July of 1893, she packed a trunk, bought 2 train tickets with money she had been setting aside since March, and did not look back at Columbus, because Columbus had nothing left in it that required looking back at. The land office clerk in the town of Elk Creek looked at her the way certain men look at things they have decided in advance do not belong where they have appeared. He was 30 years old with ink on his fingers and the expression of someone who has been given a small amount of authority and has organized his entire personality around it. A woman, he said, alone with a child, to prove up a mountain claim at 7,000 feet. Edna looked at him across the counter. She signed the papers without answering. She had not come 500 miles to explain herself to a man with ink on his fingers. The cabin was 2 miles up the creek valley from town on a bench of land where the drainage flattened out before the timber started climbing toward the high ridges. Gideon had built the four walls himself in the spring of 1891, green lodgepole pine, cut from the slope up chinked with mud and grass that had mostly dried and cracked and fallen out in the 2 years since. The walls stood. That was the honest summary. They stood. The roof was half finished. Split shakes covered 2/3 of the span. The rest was open sky. There was no floor, just the bare earth Gideon had scraped flat. There was a window opening without glass covered with a piece of canvas tacked to the frame and a doorway covered with a wool blanket nailed to 2 pine boards. Edna stood in the doorway that first afternoon and looked at the inside of the cabin and breathed in the smell of old cut wood and mouse droppings and the particular cold that accumulates in unheated spaces over 2 years of mountain winters. And she thought about the 40 acres behind her and the 3 years ahead of her and the $12 in the sock at the bottom of the trunk. And she did not feel discouraged. She felt like she had work to do. The roof came first. She had never laid shakes before, but she had watched it done, and watching things done carefully is most of the education you need for most of the tasks a person ever faces. She worked from the ladder Gideon had left propped against the wall, setting shakes from the bottom course up, overlapping each row, the way shingles overlap nailing with the cut nails she had bought in town with $2 she could not really spare. Her shoulders burned by the third day. Her hands cracked and bled by the fifth. Nettie handed shakes up from the pile below, solemn and efficient, asking only once whether they were going to be warm when winter came. Edna said yes and kept working. The roof closed before September ended. When the first hard rain came down the valley, the cabin stayed dry. It was not a small thing. A dry cabin in the mountains is the difference between a structure and a home. And Edna understood this the way you understand things that you learn with your body rather than your mind. The window came next. She walked into Elk Creek and offered 2 days of laundry work to the woman who ran the boarding house in exchange for a pane of glass and a sack of flour. The glass was wavy and thin with a chip in the lower corner, but it let light in and kept wind out, and she set it in the frame with river clay and strips of salvaged cloth and stood back and looked at it in the afternoon light and felt for the first time that the cabin might actually become a place where a person could survive. That feeling lasted until she talked to Harlan Vick. Harlan was 57 years old and had been freighting goods over the Continental Divide for 11 winters without losing a wagon, though he had lost one hired man to a February snowslide in 1889 and had not talked about it much since. He was a big man, not tall but broad, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time in dangerous places and learned that unnecessary motion is its own kind of risk. He knew the mountains the way surgeons know the body, not with affection, but with precision, understanding every place where things could go wrong and exactly how badly they could go wrong there. He came by the cabin in early September, checking the condition of the creek road before the freight season ended. He stopped when he saw smoke from the chimney and a woman on the roof and a child stacking wood scraps in the yard. He watched for a moment. Then he got down from the wagon and walked over. He was not cruel about it. That was the thing about Harlan Vick. He had a wife and 4 children of his own, and he understood what it meant to count money against a mountain winter, and he did not dress the truth in cruelty because he respected the woman he was delivering it to. He told her the number plainly: 8 cords minimum to heat a cabin through a Colorado high country winter, 10 to be safe, 12 if the winter ran long, and some winters ran long. He told her what cordwood cost cut and delivered from the high timber by mule team. $60 for 8 cords uncut, 70 split, 80 split and stacked. Edna listened to all of it without changing her expression. Then she told him she had $12. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cabin, at the fresh shakes on the roof, at the new glass in the window, at the work that had been done here by someone who did not know how to do any of it and had done it anyway. Then he looked down at Nettie, who was watching him from beside the woodpile with the serious brown eyes of a child who understands that the adults around her are talking about something that matters. He pointed down the slope toward the creek bottom where the willows and alder grew thick along the water and told her she could gather brush there. Free fuel. It burned hot and fast. If she kept the stove fed through the night, she could stay warm enough. Then he looked at Nettie again. Brush burns like paper, he said. You and that little girl will be cold before midnight. He was not threatening her. He had never threatened anyone in his life. He was telling her what he knew, which was that brush caught fast and threw heat in a rush, but left no coals. And a fire built on brush was gone in 11 minutes, and without coals, there was no banking. And without banking, there was no sleeping. And the mathematics of keeping a cabin warm through a 14-hour mountain night on brush alone came down to a single brutal equation: you fed the fire, or you froze, and you could not do both and sleep. She understood him completely. She walked back to the cabin that afternoon and sat on the dirt floor and counted what she had. $12 in coin, one daughter of her dead son, one stove, a small pot-belly model that had shipped in the trunk designed for coal. No horse, no mule, no neighbors within practical distance. The high timber stood 2 miles up the slope where the lodgepole and spruce grew thick enough to build a city, but getting there meant climbing and cutting, meant axe work. She had never learned, and hauling meant either a sled or a team or a back strong enough to carry green logs down a mountain, and she had none of these things. She walked to the creek that evening and cut a bundle of willow with a borrowed hand axe and dragged it back to the cabin. It took an hour. The bundle looked substantial in the failing light. She stacked it against the wall and felt a small lift of something that might have been hope, and she held onto that feeling carefully because she knew it was fragile. Then she burned it. The willow caught fast and flared bright. The cabin felt warmer almost immediately. She watched the flames with something close to relief. Then 11 minutes later, it was ash. She sat on the floor and watched the stove tick as the iron cooled, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes to people who are good at arithmetic that she was looking at a problem that did not have a solution. Not with what she had. The numbers did not work, and they could not be made to work. She needed heat that lasted, and all she had was fuel that vanished. The next morning, she walked into Elk Creek and asked at the general store about credit. The owner shook his head without meeting her eyes. She tried the blacksmith, who said he was sorry and meant it. She walked to the boarding house where she had done the laundry work, and the woman there offered her a room in exchange for cooking and cleaning, and she stood in the doorway of that offer and felt its warmth, and then thought about the 40 acres and Gideon's papers and the 3 years remaining on the claim, and she thanked the woman and walked back up the creek road. On the way back, she passed the stone foundation of the old assay office that had burned down the previous spring. The walls were gone, but the foundation remained a rectangle of flat slate slabs set into the hillside, and she stopped because the morning sun was on them, and she reached down and touched one of the stones. It was warm, not from a fire. There was no fire. The sun had moved past it 20 minutes ago. But the slate had been drinking in heat all morning, and it was still holding what it had absorbed, releasing it slowly back into the air, the temperature of a living thing. She stood there with her hand on that stone for a long time. That night, she sat beside the stove and fed it willow bundle after bundle, watching the flames rise and fall, and timing them because she was a precise woman, and precision was how she thought through problems. The fire lasted 11 minutes, then 12, then 9 when the bundle was smaller. She calculated what she had gathered and how long it would last at this rate, and the answer was 7 days. Maybe 8. She was awake at 2 in the morning. Her back ached from the day's work, and her eyes burned from the smoke and the late hour, and she was sitting on the dirt floor beside the stove with her legs stretched out and her hands in her lap when she noticed something. The dirt floor near the stove was warm, not warm the way a floor gets warm when a fire has been burning directly above it for hours. The stove sat on a pad of flat stones elevated. The warmth was not conducting down through the iron in the stone pad. It was coming from somewhere else. From the smoke, maybe from the hot gases that traveled the length of the firebox before going up the pipe from the way the cabin is set slightly raised on its foundation logs, with a gap beneath the floor where the air moved from whatever happened to heat in the dark spaces under a mountain cabin when fire ran through it. She pressed her palm flat to the dirt and held it there. Warm, the temperature of a body, alive. She thought about the slate foundation on the hill. She thought about the heat it had held after the sun moved on. Dense material, she thought. Mass. The Romans had understood something about this. She had seen it once in a book at the boarding house in Denver, a drawing of ancient baths with fires burning in channels beneath the floors, hot gases traveling through stone passages warming everything above. The caption had said they heated not by filling the room with fire, but by filling the stone with heat. Stone held heat. Earth held heat. If you could push fire through them, they would do the work that brush could not. She sat on the dirt floor of the cabin at 2 in the morning in the Colorado mountains with her back against the cold wall and thought it through completely every step, every problem she could see, every answer she could work out. The cabin floor was dirt never planked. Beneath it, earth. She had no money for cordwood. She had no money for almost anything. But she had a borrowed hand axe and access to the creek's stones and the particular kind of time that belongs to people who have nothing left to protect except the thing they came for. She got up off the floor at 3 in the morning and went to the sleeping platform and lay down beside Nettie and listened to the wind outside and did not sleep. In the morning, she told Nettie they were going to dig up the floor. The child looked at her across the cold cabin with those serious eyes. All of it. Most of it, Edna said. Edna, bring me the flat stones from the creek, the ones you can carry. She picked up the broken shovel handle that had come with the cabin and got down on her knees in the dirt and started. The construction took 11 days. That was how long it took Edna Marsh, 64 years old, to dig up the floor of her own cabin and rebuild it into something that might keep 2 people alive through a Colorado mountain winter. 11 days from the morning, she picked up the broken shovel handle to the evening she set the last floorboard and stood back and looked at what her hands had made. She would not have called it easy. She would not have called it anything because she was not a woman who spent words on things that were simply required. The first 3 days were excavation. She had mapped it out the night before on a scrap of paper by candlelight, the way her father had taught her to think through problems on paper first, then in the world. 3 main trenches running roughly north to south beneath the sleeping area, each 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, connected by a crosswise channel near the back wall that would distribute the flow. The firebox sat in the northwest corner, which meant the smoke would enter the channel system there and travel the full length of the cabin before finding its way out through the vent she would punch through the back wall. She drew it twice, rubbed it out, drew it again. Then she picked up the shovel and started. The dirt beneath the cabin floor was not the soft earth it looked like from the surface. 2 years of cold and freeze and thaw had compacted it into something closer to soft stone, and the shovel handle flexed and jumped with each strike. She found roots at 6 inches, stones at a foot, and once at 14 inches in the northeast corner, what appeared to be the remains of an old campfire ash and charred wood from whoever had sheltered on this bench of land before Gideon ever filed his claim. She worked from the knees because there was not room to stand inside the trenches at their early depth, and by the end of the first day her knees were bruised dark through the fabric of her dress, and her lower back had developed a pain that lived just above her left hip and made itself known every time she straightened up. She straightened up anyway. Nettie carried stones from the creek. This was the work the child could do, and she did it with the serious, methodical efficiency. That was her primary characteristic, making trub after trub down the slope and back with her arms full, and her boots dark from the creek water, stacking the flat pieces the way Edna showed her broad faces up beside the cabin door. She asked questions only when she needed to, which Edna had always considered one of the most undervalued qualities in a person of any age. The second and third days, Edna moved earth. She filled the wheelbarrow Gideon had left behind and pushed it out the cabin door and around the corner and dumped the excavated soil against the north wall, where it would eventually become additional insulation. The wheelbarrow had a bent axle that made it want to pull left, and she compensated for this automatically by the second trip and did not think about it again. By the end of the third day, the main trenches were open. On the fourth day, she began laying the stone lining, and this was the work that mattered most. The trench walls had to hold their shape when heat came through them. Loose earth would crack and collapse. She needed the flat creek stones set against the sides with their broad faces inward, angled slightly, so the top of each trench would be narrower than the bottom, creating a channel that would direct the moving air downward and outward into the earth and stone, rather than simply passing through on its way to the vent. She had thought about this the way she thought about everything, which was to hold the problem in her mind and turn it until she could see all its faces, and what she saw was that the channel needed to slow the moving air, not rush it. Heat transferred to mass only when it had time to transfer. A fast-moving column of smoke would carry its energy out the vent without leaving much behind. A slow-moving column would give up its heat to the stone on every side. 1 inch of drop for every 12 inches of length. Not flat, not steep, 1 inch per foot exactly. She had calculated this the way you calculate things when the stakes are real, and the margin for error is small by working backward from what she needed and forward from what she had, and finding the place where those two lines met. River clay dug from the creek bank and water that was already cold enough to make her hands ache served as mortar. She packed it between the stones and pressed it smooth with her bare hands because the rags she had wrapped them in soaked through within an hour, and she had given up replacing them. The clay numbed her fingers until she could not feel the difference between the stone and the space between the stones, and she worked by pressure and geometry instead of sensation, setting each piece the way a blind person reads through what could be known without seeing. By the sixth day, the main trenches were lined. She sat on the dirt floor that evening and looked at what she had made. The trenches ran north to south in parallel lines beneath the space where the sleeping platform would go, connected at the far end waiting. They were not beautiful. They were not elegant. They were 3 channels cut into the earth and lined with river stone and sealed with creek clay, and they were exactly what she needed them to be. Then Dorset Callum came. He was 51 years old, her nearest neighbor, a homesteader 2 miles down the creek, who had been on this land for 6 years and had the particular confidence of a man who has survived enough hard seasons to believe that his survival is evidence of superior judgment rather than a combination of preparation and good fortune. He had come to borrow a hand tool, a farrier's rasp he had seen Gideon use once and thought Edna might still have. He found her standing in a trench in the middle of her own floor. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the excavated cabin, the lined channels, the piles of creek stone waiting against the walls, the crude wooden frame she had built to hold the pipe diversion above the firebox opening. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man watching someone do something that cannot be undone. She explained it to him as she had explained it to herself, the same way in the same order, because that was how the logic ran, and the logic did not change depending on who was hearing it. The channels, the stone, the way the smoke would carry heat through the mass and leave it there, the way the stone would release that stored heat for hours after the fire died, the slow burn made permanent in earth and rock. He listened with his arms crossed and his weight on his back foot, which was how he listened to things he did not intend to change his mind about. When she finished, he said the smoke would back up. He said the fire risk was unacceptable. He said this in October when she still had time to gather fuel the ordinary way to cut and haul brush, until her arms gave out to do what other people did, even knowing it was not enough, and that when it failed in January, she would at least have failed in a way that people recognized. He said it in the particular voice men use when they believe they are protecting you from yourself, which sounds like concern and feels like a door closing. He looked at Nettie, who was sitting on the sleeping platform with a pile of creek stones sorted by size, and he said that the child would pay the price. He took the rasp from the nail where it hung on the wall and left. Edna stood in the trench and listened to his footsteps cross the yard and fade. She thought about what he had said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all difficult things, without dismissing it and without letting it decide for her. He was not wrong about the risks. Smoke could back up if the draft failed. Fire could spread if the pipe connection was not sealed properly. She had thought about both of these things at length and had worked out answers that she believed were sufficient, but she had never built anything like this, and she could not be certain that the answers she had worked out would hold in practice. She was 64 years old alone on a mountain in October, and she did not know with certainty that what she was building would work. That night, she lay on the sleeping platform in the cold cabin and stared at the rough cottonwood poles above her and thought it through again, the whole sequence, start to finish. She found no new objections she had not already considered. She found no place where the logic broke down. She found only the same answer she had been finding since the night she pressed her palm to the warm earth and understood what the ground beneath her was capable of. She got up before dawn and went back to work. The pipe problem was the hardest part. The potbelly stove had a single exhaust pipe 6 inches in diameter that ran straight up through the roof. She needed to intercept that exhaust before it left the building and redirect it down and into the first channel, letting it travel the full length of the channel system before it finally vented outside through the back wall. This meant bending the pipe at a sharp angle, running a horizontal section across the firebox area, and creating a sealed connection where the metal pipe met the stone and clay channel entrance. She did not have enough pipe. She did not have money to buy pipe. She went to see Nora Fenn. Nora was 71 years old. a widow who had been on her small place at the edge of town since her husband died in 1880, surviving by trading labor and small goods with whoever needed what she had to offer. She had a pile of salvaged stovepipe behind her woodshed, bent sections and rusted elbows, and mismatched fittings that had been replaced over the years when better parts arrived from Denver. She had been keeping them because she was a woman who kept things on the principle that you cannot know in advance which useless object will one day become necessary. The price was 2 days of spinning work. Edna agreed without calculation because there was nothing to calculate. It was the only source of the materials she needed within reach, and the work was work she could do. She walked to Nora's place and worked the spinning wheel for 12 hours each day for 2 days, producing rough wool thread that Nora would sell to a weaver in Elk Creek before the first snow. The wheel was old and wanted oiling, and the treadle had a tendency to stick on the back stroke, and she managed both of these problems automatically within the first hour and did not think about them again. She thought about the cabin, about the trenches waiting in the cold dark under the lifted floorboards, about October moving through its middle days toward November with the efficiency of something that has a schedule to keep, about Nettie asking on the second evening at Nora's whether she could come home now. She walked home on the third morning with the salvaged pipe sections tied in a bundle across her shoulders and let herself into the cabin and set down the bundle and stood for a moment in the cold interior looking at the open trenches. Nettie appeared from the sleeping area. "There is frost on the inside of the window," the child said. Edna looked at the window. A thin skim of ice had formed along the lower edge of the glass where the clay ceiling had shrunk slightly away from the frame in the night cold. She noted it. She would reseal it when the pipework was done. She picked up the bent sections and began fitting them together. The pipe connection took the better part of 2 days. She bent the main section at approximately 30 degrees by scoring the metal with a file and working it against the edge of the stone pad until the crease formed where she needed it. The horizontal run she assembled from 3 shorter pieces overlapping the joints and wrapping them tight with strips of canvas she had cut from the wool blanket that used to serve as their door. She sealed every joint with creek clay pressed firmly into the gaps and smoothed with her thumb. The entry into the first channel she flanged outward by cutting a series of small notches around the pipe end and bending the tabs out like a flower opening, creating a collar that seated into the clay lining of the channel and locked in place when she packed additional clay around it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the assembly. It was ugly. It would not have passed any inspection by any engineer anywhere in Colorado. The bends were approximate. The joints were wrapped in cloth and sealed with mud dug from a creek bank by a 64-year-old woman's frozen hands. The whole thing had a provisional improvised quality that reflected accurately the conditions under which it had been built. She lit the stove. The first hour, nothing she could detect. The smoke was drawing, she could hear it, that particular absence of sound that meant the draft was pulling rather than pushing. The slight negative pressure in the firebox that told her the gases were moving in the right direction. But she had not burned enough fuel yet to charge the stone mass with any meaningful heat. She fed the fire for a second hour. Brush burning fast, the way brush always burned, but the system was now full of hot gases traveling the length of the channel and back and out through the vent she had punched through the back wall with a cold chisel and lined with scrap tin. After 2 hours, she pressed her palm to the earth beside the first channel. Warm, not hot, not dramatic. The temperature of a body of living skin. The stone had been absorbing the moving heat, and it had stored what it had absorbed, and it was giving it back now through the packed earth above the channel to the surface where her hand lay flat. She pressed her hand to the stone lining where it met the floor surface. Warmer still. She fed the stove another bundle. The flames roared. She could feel the heat building beneath her knees as she knelt beside the channel, moving through the earth the way water moves through sand, finding the available spaces and filling them. When the fire burned down after 20 minutes, she pressed her palm to the earth again. Still warm. The warmth was still there 10 minutes after the fire died. 15 minutes. 20. The stone had taken what the fire offered, and it was holding it the way the slate foundation on the hill had held the morning sun slowly, patiently, because that was the nature of mass, and that was what mass did. Nettie had been watching from the doorway of the sleeping area. She crossed the room and lowered herself to her knees and pressed her cheek to the floorboard that lay beside the open channel. "Warm," the child said. "It is warm." Edna sat on the dirt floor with her hands in her lap, and let herself feel for exactly one moment the particular relief of a thing working as designed. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Relief, the specific physical unwinding of a tension you have been holding so long you had stopped noticing it was there. Then she got up and began laying the floorboards. Rufus Olander came on a Thursday. He was 46 years old and ran the wood hauling operation out of the high timber with 3 mule teams and a crew of hired men in contracts with most of the settled families who could afford to pay for the service. He had a business built on the proposition that cordwood was the only answer to a Colorado winter, and he had been right about this for long enough that he had stopped considering whether it might ever not be true. He stood in the doorway and looked at the torn-up floor, the pipe assembly, the crude channel openings visible where the boards had not yet been laid, and at Nettie sitting near the stove on the one section of finished flooring, and he shook his head with an expression Edna recognized from the land office clerk and from Dorset Callum, the expression of a man whose understanding of things does not include the possibility that someone outside his experience might know something he does not. He made his offer. $40 now, 40 by Christmas. 8 cords of split pine delivered before first snow. He said it was a fair price, and it was a fair price, and she knew it was a fair price, and so did he. She said no. He looked at the channel system the way you look at something you are going to remember later as evidence of poor judgment. He said warm dirt was not going to save that child when January hit. He said he had watched strong people die in these mountains because they thought they could outthink the cold. She did not answer. He said the offer was good through November. After that, the price would go up. He turned in the doorway and then stopped. I have seen people die in these mountains, he said. Good people. People with more than you have got. They die because they think they are smarter than winter. And winter does not care how clever you are. Winter just keeps coming. He left. Edna looked at the space where he had been standing. Then she picked up a floorboard and set it in place and drove the first nail. Harlan Vick came in mid-November. He came on horseback, checking the condition of the creek road before he committed a loaded wagon to it for the last haul of the season, and he stopped when he saw the smoke from the cabin chimney and turned up the track because he had been thinking about the woman and the child since September, and it seemed right to know how they were getting on. He came inside when she invited him and stood in the finished cabin boards under his feet, stove burning in the corner, Nettie at the table with a piece of mending. He looked around for a moment. Then he looked down at the floor. He took off his glove and crouched and pressed his bare palm flat against the boards. He held it there. When he stood up, his face had changed in the small, controlled way the faces of practical men change when they encounter something that revises their understanding of a situation. Warm, he said. It is actually warm. Yes, Edna said. He walked the length of the room, pressing his hand to the floor in different places. Near the stove in the middle toward the back wall. The temperature varied, hotter near the firebox and cooler toward the vent, but nowhere was it cold. How long, he said. After the fire goes out. 4 hours, maybe 5 if I bank the stove before bed. Harlan stood in the middle of the room and calculated silently. She could see him doing it, the same arithmetic she had been running since September, the one that always came back to the same problem. 4 hours was better than nothing. 4 hours was considerably better than the 11 minutes a brush fire gave you. But 4 hours was not 8, and a January night in the Colorado mountains ran 14 hours long. It is clever, he said. I will grant you that. She waited. He looked at the brush pile stacked against the south wall, the supply she had built up through October and the early weeks of November, every hour she could spare from the construction work spent at the creek cutting and hauling. That is a great deal of brush, he said. More than anyone has seen me collect, she said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The wind moved outside. The stove ticked. Brush is brush, he said. It burns fast and then it is gone. When that pile is ash, you will be in the same position you were in September. Only it will be February and the pass will be closed and there will be no reaching you. He reached for his hat. I buried a man in February once, he said. Found him in May when the snow came off. He was a hired man. Strongfellow knew this country. He had a rope. He had done everything right. He still guessed wrong in the white blindness, and guessing wrong was enough. He looked at her steadily. He looked peaceful, Harlan said. That is what I want you to understand. At the end, they say it feels like going to sleep. He put his hat on and walked to the door. Edna stood in the middle of the warm floor and listened to his boots on the boards, and then on the frozen ground outside, and then nothing. She stood there for another minute. Then she picked up the shovel. The second phase of construction took 8 more days and came very close to breaking her. She extended the channels toward the walls, adding lateral branches that would spread the warmth across a wider floor area, addressing the cold spots she had noted in the corners, where the heat from the main trenches did not reach. She deepened the main channels another 6 inches, giving them more volume to fill with moving air, more stone surface to absorb the passing heat. She dragged granite slabs from a rock slide half a mile up the hill above the cabin. This was the hardest work of all of it. The slabs were flat and dense, and she needed them for the channel floor where the heat would be most concentrated, where she wanted maximum mass to take the energy and hold it. She could not carry them. She could barely move them. She wrapped a length of rope around each one and dragged it down the slope, a few feet at a time, pulling, resting again, her boots finding purchase in the frozen ground, while the stone scraped and caught on every irregularity. By the 4th day of Phase 2, she had lost weight she could not afford to lose. By the 6th day, her hands had stopped healing between sessions. The cracks in her palms opened each morning when she gripped the shovel and stayed open all day, and crusted overnight and opened again in the morning. She wrapped them in strips of cloth that she rewrapped when they soaked through. She noted this without dwelling on it, because dwelling on it would not close the cracks. Her back locked up on the 7th morning so severely that she spent 20 minutes on the cold floor before she could stand lying flat with her knees bent and her arms at her sides. The way she had learned over years of hard work was the fastest way to let the spasm release. Nettie sat in the doorway of the sleeping area and watched her with the serious, worried eyes of a child who understands that the adult responsible for her survival is failing in some technical sense, but who does not know what to do about it. Edna looked at the ceiling above her. She thought about Dorset Callum and his crossed arms and his prediction that the child would pay the price. She thought about Rufus Olander and his 8 cords of split pine and the confidence of a man who has been right about things for so long he has forgotten what being wrong feels like. She thought about Harlan Vick and the hired man found in May, with a rope in his hand, looking peaceful the way people look when the cold has finished its work. She got up off the floor. She picked up the shovel. On the 19th of November, she was outside gathering brush when the snow began. Not a blizzard. Not yet. A steady, serious fall that blanked the valley in white and reduced the visible world to the length of her outstretched arm. The pass would close within a day. Whatever she had built would have to be enough. She stood at the cabin window that evening and watched the snow pile against the brush stack, climbing the sides of it, pressing down on the canvas tarp she had spread over the top. She lit the stove and fed it until the flames ran orange. The floorboards warmed beneath her feet. The stone beneath them warmed. The cabin temperature climbed and held, while the snow fell outside and the wind moaned under the roof edge. 6 hours after the fire died, she pressed her palm to the boards. Warm, not the warmth of earlier in the season when the stone mass had been new and unevenly charged. This was the warmth of a system that had found its balanced stone, that had been absorbing and releasing heat for weeks, and had developed the steady, patient temperature of something that has been doing the same work long enough to be good at it. She pressed her palm flat and held it and felt the heat coming up through the wood from the earth below, and thought about the slate foundation on the hill above town, warm in the afternoon, long after the sun had moved on, holding what it had been given and giving it back slowly. The stone was doing what stone does. She did not know yet if it would be enough. She did not know yet what was coming, but she had built the best thing she knew how to build with what she had, and the floor was warm, and that was not nothing. Outside in the dark, in the snow, somewhere in the mountains to the west, a pressure system was organizing itself along the high ridges. Cold air from the north, dense and patient, moving south at altitude, gathering velocity as it funneled between the peaks. The barometric pressure had been dropping since noon, though Edna had no instrument to measure it. The animals along the creek had been quiet all day, in the way animals are quiet before the kind of weather that changes what a winter means. She did not know about the system building in the west. She fed the stove one more time before bed, a larger fire than usual, and felt the warmth rise through the boards and into the soles of her feet, and went to the sleeping platform and lay down beside Nettie and pulled the blankets around them both. The wind picked up in the night. She heard it change the way experienced people hear. Weather changed not in the volume of it, but in the character, from the ordinary movement of cold air through a mountain valley to something else, something with intention and direction, and the particular persistence of weather that has gathered energy over a long distance and arrived ready to spend it. She lay in the dark and listened. The floor beneath the sleeping platform was warm through the boards. She pressed her foot against the wood and felt the heat that had been stored in granite and creekstone through the afternoon's burning still there, still rising patient as the earth it was buried in. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The storm arrived on the 9th of January, 1894. It did not arrive the way winter storms usually arrive in the mountains, with clouds thickening over 2 days and pressure dropping, and a morning of light flurries before the real snow begins. This storm came the way violence comes without the courtesy of warning in the space between 1 hour and the next. At noon, the sky was pale and clear and cold in the ordinary way of a Colorado January, the kind of cold that sits in the lungs like iron when you breathe it but does not threaten, does not press, simply reminds you of where you are and what season holds you. Edna was outside at the brush pile pulling sections loose from the frozen mass, her breath clouding white in the still air, her boots squeaking on the packed snow, the way Harlan Vick had told her snow squeaked only when the temperature dropped below 20 below. It had been squeaking since morning. She had noted it. She had worked faster. At 1 o'clock, the sky to the northwest changed color. Not gray, not the standard gray of incoming weather. A particular shade that had no name. She knew something between pewter and bruised the color of sky that has been compressed by something enormous moving behind it. The light went flat, the shadows disappeared. The wind, which had been still all morning, began. Not gradually, not building from nothing through stages. One moment the air was quiet. The next it was moving at a speed that took the breath from her mouth before she could draw it in. She dropped the brush bundle. She ran for the cabin. 50 yards. She had measured it once walking it in the autumn when the distances were still visible and the world still made geographic sense. 50 yards from the brush pile to the cabin door. The wind hit 70 miles an hour before she covered half the distance. She could not see the cabin. She could not see the ground directly in front of her feet. The snow was not falling from above, but moving horizontally driven at speed, filling the air at every level with white, that had no orientation, no up or down, no distance or direction, only the white itself and the wind that carried it and the cold underneath, both that found the skin of her face and hands in seconds and began its work. She ran toward where she believed the cabin was. Her face went numb before she reached the door. Her fingers inside their gloves lost sensation in the last 20 yards, and when she grabbed the door latch, she could not feel the iron, could not feel whether she had gripped it or not, and she pushed with her shoulder instead and fell through the doorway and pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the dark cabin breathing. Nettie was at the window pressed against the wall beside it, the way Edna had told her to stand near glass in heavy weather. "Get away from the window," Edna said. "Now." The child moved. The storm built through the afternoon with the steady, committed energy of something that has been planning this for a long time. By 3 o'clock, the wind was constant, not gusting, but sustained a wall of moving air that pressed against the cabin walls and found every gap in the chinking and every space where the window clay had dried and pulled back from the frame and poured through those gaps at speed, carrying cold. That was not ordinary cold, but something of a different order. Something that did not simply lower the temperature, but seemed to attack it, to actively pursue the warmth inside the cabin, the way a living thing pursues what it wants. The temperature outside had dropped 40 degrees since morning. Edna lit the stove. She fed it everything she could reach, brush pulled from the indoor stack she had moved inside at the beginning of December against exactly this possibility, the largest bundles first packing the firebox until the iron glowed a dull red, and the pipe above it ticked with the expansion of metal pushed to its limit. The smoke poured into the channel system, and she heard the draft working that subtle whisper of air in motion through enclosed stone, pulling the gases the full length of the channels and back out through the vent in the rear wall. She pressed her foot to the floor. The boards were warm, 50 degrees, then 52, but the cabin air was fighting her. The walls were green lodgepole pine chinked with mud and dried grass adequate for a normal Colorado winter, not designed for 70-mile-an-hour winds that treated every small imperfection as an opening. The door was solid pine planks on iron hinges. But it was a door, not a bank vault, and the gap at the bottom let in a blade of cold air that moved across the floor at ankle height and did not stop. The window was worse. The clay ceiling she had pressed into the frame in September had dried and cracked over the winter months. And there were places now where the cold came through not as draft but as presence. A cold that was simply there on the inside of the glass and on the wall around it and radiating inward. 50 degrees became 48, then 46. She fed the stove harder. The firebox could only accept so much fuel at once, and she had reached that limit. She waited for the first load to reduce and fed it again, the flames roaring orange and then white at the center, the stone in the channels heating toward their limit. 45 degrees, 43. The storm was not simply lowering the outside temperature. It was pressurizing the cold, driving it through every weakness in the structure with the force of the wind behind it and no fire she could build inside a potbelly. Stove was going to overcome the laws of thermodynamics. Heat moved from hot to cold. The cabin was warmer than outside. The cold would keep coming in until there was no difference left. The floor was her only advantage. The stone beneath it did not care about the wind. The stone was 5 feet below grade, surrounded by earth on every side, and the earth at that depth maintained its temperature regardless of what happened on the surface. The channels were sealed, and the heat in them was stored, and it would release upward through the floor, whether the wind was blowing or not, because the wind could not reach it. The wind could attack the walls. It could find the window gaps and the door crack and the spaces in the chinking. But it could not reach 5 feet into the ground where the granite slabs lay warm in their clay beds. She fed the stove every 30 minutes through the afternoon. The floor held at 48. The cabin air held at 43. It was cold. It was genuinely, seriously cold inside a structure that contained a burning stove and a woman working as hard as she could to maintain it. But it was not the 34 degrees of that morning, 3 days later, that she would think of as the low point of her life on this mountain. Not yet. The night of the first day was manageable. She slept in shifts of 2 hours, waking to feed the stove and check the floor temperature and check Nettie, and then lying back down on the platform with the blankets pulled over both of them. The floor was warm under the boards, and the warmth rose through the sleeping platform and held in the blankets, and Nettie slept deeply in the way children sleep when they have been frightened and are now safe enough to let the fear go. Edna watched the child's face in the firelight between feedings and thought about Dorset Callum saying the child would pay the price, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. On the morning of the second day, the brush pile outside was buried. She knew this without looking because she could no longer hear it, the small creaking sound the frozen bundles made when the wind moved through them. The wind had packed snow against the north wall until it reached the window ledge, and she could see the white pressed against the glass from inside the window, reduced to a dim gray square that let in light from no particular direction. She had wood inside. She had planned for this. She had moved 2 weeks of indoor fuel into the cabin in early December, stacked against the east wall where it took up floor space she could not afford, but provided the only insurance she could give to herself against being cut off from the outdoor pile. She still needed more. On the second morning, she put on everything she owned in layers, her dress and her wool coat and the oilskins she had brought from Ohio that had seemed excessive in September and was not excessive now, and she pushed open the cabin door against the weight of the drift that had built against it and dug with her hands and a flat board until she had a path, and then she fought her way to the brush pile through wind that wanted to push her sideways and cold that closed around her face like a hand. The canvas tarp had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. She clawed through the drift with her bare hands because gloves could not grip the frozen bundles, and she pulled out armfuls of willow and alder and hauled them back through the path she had cut and through the door and dropped them on the floor inside. Her hands were the color of chalk when she got them inside. She held them over the stove until the color came back and the feeling came back with it, which was worse than the numbness, the feeling coming back in that particular way that made her clench her teeth and breathe through her nose and wait for it to pass. Then she picked up another load and went back out. She made 4 trips. On the 4th trip, she stumbled, coming back through the door, and went down on one knee on the floor and stayed there for a moment with her head down and her hands flat on the warm boards and breathed. The boards were warm under her palms. 46 degrees 47, the stone below still working, still releasing what it had stored steady and patient and utterly indifferent to the crisis happening above it. She got up. She fed the stove with the fresh fuel, and the flames roared, and the channels filled with hot gas, and the floor climbed back toward 50. Outside, the storm continued. It was on the second night that Nettie's fever came. Edna did not see it develop because she had been focused on the fire and the floor temperature and the state of the fuel supply and the condition of the window ceiling and all the other things that required monitoring in a structure fighting a blizzard on its own. She noticed it when she went to check on the child during a 2 o'clock feeding and put her hand to Nettie's forehead in the routine way she checked her each time and felt the heat there that was not the heat of the warm blankets, but the specific dry heat of a body running its own internal fire. The child's eyes opened. "I am cold," Nettie said. "Edna did not say you are burning with fever." She did not say that the two things were not contradictions, that a fever could make you feel cold, even when your temperature was climbing, that the body's thermostat had been reset and it was calling for heat it did not need. She did not explain any of this because explaining it would not help. She said, "I know. Stay still." She had willow bark, tea-dried bark she had stripped from the creek willows in October and kept in a cloth bag hanging from a nail beside the firebox. She boiled creek water in the tin pot and steeped the bark for 10 minutes and poured the tea into the tin cup and held it to Nettie's lips. The child drank a few sips, turned her face away. "I am tired," she said. "Sleep then," Edna said. "I am here." She fed the stove. The floor temperature was holding at 46. The cabin air was 41. The fever was real, and the medicine was the oldest medicine she knew. And it would help or it would not, and she could not do more than she was doing. She sat beside the sleeping platform on the three-legged stool that was the only piece of furniture Gideon had completed, and watched Nettie breathe and fed the stove when it needed feeding, and did not let herself think beyond the next hour. This was the discipline, not courage, not strength, just the management of attention, the practice of keeping the mind on the thing directly in front of it, instead of letting it run ahead to all the bad outcomes waiting in the future. She had learned this from her mother. Her mother had learned it from her mother. It was the knowledge that women pass to each other in the practical ways. Knowledge passed, not written down, not spoken directly, but demonstrated in the way a person holds themselves when things are going wrong. She fed the stove. She watched Nettie breathe. She had been awake for 36 hours when she sat down on the three-legged stool and told herself she would close her eyes for 20 minutes, no more, and the stove had enough fuel for an hour, and she would hear it when it died down. She heard nothing. She woke to cold. The stove was dark. The firebox had burned down completely while she slept, the coals cooling through gray to ash without her hearing the change in the iron, without the cold waking her, the way cold usually woke her because she was too exhausted to feel it until it had already taken the room down to 34 degrees, 34 degrees. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Moving to the stove, finding the matches on the shelf, the first one breaking, the second catching the kindling, taking the flame in the way kindling took it, when the air was cold enough that everything was perfectly dry and the fire wanted desperately to happen. She fed the stove. The flames rose orange and then white, and the iron began to tick. She pressed her palm to the floor. Nothing. The boards were cold. The stone beneath them was cold. The thermal mass that had stored heat through weeks of daily burning had discharged completely while she slept, all of it given back to the cabin air, and then to the storm outside, spent empty, waiting to be refilled. It would take hours. She went to the sleeping platform and wrapped herself around Nettie, her body against the child's body, every blanket piled over them both, holding the small frame that was shivering now in the thin, rapid way of a body that is working very hard to do something it is losing the resources to do. She held her. The floor temperature began its climb. 34 degrees, 36, 38. She held Nettie and watched the numbers rise in her mind, and fed the stove when she could leave the child long enough, and came back and held her again and waited. 40 degrees, 42. Nettie's shivering slowed. "Stay with me," Edna said. "Stay right here." The child's breathing changed from the short, rapid breaths of cold distress to something slower and more sustainable, and Edna felt the small body begin to unclench muscle by muscle, the way cold bodies unclenched when warmth found them. The floor was 45 degrees, then 48. The fever broke sometime in the dark hours of that third night. Edna felt it go, the particular change in the quality of the heat coming off the child's skin, from that dry, demanding fever heat to the different warmth of a body that has finished fighting something and is now simply resting. She pressed the back of her hand to Nettie's forehead and held it there. She closed her eyes. On the morning of the third day, the storm was over, not fading, not diminishing through stages. It stopped. The wind, which had been a constant presence for 60 hours, simply ceased between one breath and the next. And the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that Edna woke from a shallow sleep believing something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. She lay still for a moment and listened to the silence. Then she got up and opened the cabin door. 3 feet of snow had drifted against it, and she pushed through the drift and stood in the January morning air that was cold and still and absolutely clear of the sky above the mountains, the particular blue that follows storms in the high country, deep and depthless and empty of anything except light. The snow squeaked under her boots. She stood at the cabin door and looked at the world the storm had made. The brush pile was gone under a drift that reached the cabin eaves on the north side. The path to the creek had disappeared. The familiar shapes of the landscape, the bench of land, the slope above the timber line were all present, but altered, covered in white, that had been worked into forms by the wind, sculptural and arbitrary and indifferent to what had been there before. She went back inside. She checked Nettie. The fever was gone. The child's breathing was slow and deep, the breathing of genuine sleep rather than sick sleep, and the color had returned to her face. She built a fire and let the floor warm, and sat on the 3-legged stool and drank hot water from the tin cup and waited. 2 hours later, she heard voices outside, footsteps in the snow, the crunch of boots that had not been there before. More than one person. She opened the door. Harlan Vick was standing in the yard with 2 men she recognized from town, the blacksmith and a farmer named Cutter, who lived 4 miles down the valley. They had shovels and a canvas sack and the particular expressions of people who have been doing something difficult and are not finished yet. "We came to check on you," Harlan said. He said it plainly without elaboration, and she understood from the plainness of it that checking on her had not been the first thing they came to check on. She stepped aside and let them in. The 3 men entered the cabin and stopped. The warmth hit them the way warmth always hit people coming in from a Colorado January, like a physical thing, a wall of air so much warmer than what they had been breathing that it registered as almost shocking. But this was not the ordinary warmth of a good fire in a cold room. The fire in the stove was modest, a maintenance burn, and the room was warm in a different way evenly, and from below the boards under their boots releasing heat that had been stored for days. Harlan looked down at his feet. He crouched. He pulled off his glove and pressed his bare palm flat against the floorboards, the way he had done in November, the same gesture, the same deliberate testing of a thing that should not be true. He held his hand there longer this time. When he stood up, his face had changed in a way that went past the small, controlled revision of November. This was something larger. This was the face of a man who has been wrong about something important and knows it and is not hiding from it. He looked at Edna. "The Kinyar place," he said. She waited. He said, "We found them this morning, the whole family. The stove was full of ash. Cold. The cabin was 50 degrees inside when we opened the door, maybe colder. They had burned through everything they had in the first night. By the second night, the cabin was cold. By the third night, they were not fighting anymore." He stopped. "They had 8 cords of split pine," he said. 8 cords. It was not enough. The blacksmith and the farmer named Cutter stood near the door with their hats in their hands. Nobody spoke for a moment. The stove ticked. The floor was warm under everyone's boots. "How much brush have you burned?" Harlan said. Edna thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Half the pile," she said. "Maybe a little more." He looked at her. "Half your brush pile," he said. "And you are warmer than people who burned 8 cords of split pine." She said, "The floor holds it. The stone, the earth, it does not matter how fast the brush burns. What matters is what absorbs the heat and holds it and gives it back slowly. The brush is just the fire. The stone is the fuel." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. He turned to the blacksmith and the farmer. "Go back to town," he said. "Tell Dorset Callum what you have seen here. Tell Rufus Olander. Tell everyone you know who is still heating with a stove and nothing else." Well, the 2 men looked around the cabin one more time, at the floor, at the stove, at Nettie asleep on the platform with color in her face, at the 64-year-old woman standing in the middle of it all with cracked hands and a straight back, in the particular expression of someone who did what was required and is not interested in being congratulated for it. They left. Harlan stayed. He sat down on the three-legged stool and looked at the floor. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I told you in September that brush burns like paper. I told you that child would be cold before midnight." She said, "You told me the truth as you knew it." "I told you what I had seen," he said. "I had not seen this." He gestured at the floor, the whole system. The channels buried beneath the boards, in the stone in the channels, in the warmth rising through all of it from the earth below. "I have been freighting these mountains for 11 years. I have buried a man who knew more than me and you put together." He looked at her steadily. "You figured out something none of us understood." She did not know what to say to this. The simplest things are true without needing elaboration, and this was one of them, and she let it be true without adding to it. Harlan fed the stove while she slept for 3 hours, the first real sleep she had managed since the storm began, lying on the platform beside Nettie, with the blankets over both of them and the warm floor beneath the boards, and the quiet that had replaced the wind. When she woke, the cabin was 54 degrees, and the floor was warm enough to walk on in her socks, and Harlan was sitting on the stool reading a seed catalog he had found on the shelf above the firebox. He left without making a ceremony of it, the way practical people leave when the thing they came for has been accomplished. She stood in the doorway and watched him go. Dorset Callum came 4 days later. He came on foot through the broken trail that the search party had made coming and going, his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned to the throat. He stood in the cabin doorway and looked at the floor and then at Edna, and then at the floor again. He said, "I told you the child would pay the price." She waited. He said, "I was wrong. I said it would back up with smoke. I said the fire risk was too high. I said by November you would have no floor and no heat." He stopped. "All of it was wrong," she said. "You told me what you believed." He said, "I believed what I had seen before. I had not seen this." He pressed his boot against the floor. Still warm 4 days after the storm, his jaw worked. "That is something." He stood there for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way men nod when they have said the thing they came to say and do not have anything to add to it, and he left. Rufus Olander came in February. The temperature had climbed back above zero, and the snow on the south slopes was beginning to settle, and the pass would open within a month. And he drove his wagon up the creek road and stopped at the cabin and knocked on the doorframe and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He was a man who had built a business on being right about what winter required. He looked at the floor with the expression of someone who has encountered information that requires him to revise a position he has held for a long time and is deciding whether to do that revision out loud or keep it inside. He reached into his coat. He produced a folded paper, a receipt marked paid in full for $40. The $40 she had refused to owe him. "Consider it settled," he said. "You do not owe me anything." He paused. "I owe you." He turned and walked back to his wagon. She watched him go. Then she closed the door and went to the stove and added a piece of wood and crouched beside the first channel and pressed her palm to the floor and held it there. Warm, steady, patient. The stone below was doing what stone does. What stone had always done, what it would keep doing long after she was gone from this mountain and this cabin and this life. Absorbing and holding and releasing the cycle running on without requiring anything from anyone, the physics of mass and heat playing out in the dark beneath her feet, the way it had been playing out since before there were people to benefit from it. She had only made it useful. That was all she had done. She had looked at what was already there and found the shape of a solution that the earth itself had been holding, waiting for someone to ask the right question. In the spring of that year, she walked to the first 3 houses in the settlement that asked for her help. She carried the diagram she had drawn, the channel layout, and the stone placement, and the pipe angles on a piece of brown paper folded in her coat pocket. She walked through each cabin and looked at the floor and the stove, and the way the space was arranged, and drew variations on the same principle, adapted to what each family had and where their heat was needed most. She did not charge for any of it. It was not hers to charge for. She had not invented it. She had remembered it from a drawing in a book in a boarding house in Denver and applied it to a problem that was killing people on a Colorado mountain, and the Romans who designed it 2,000 years ago had not charged anyone either. She proved up the claim in the spring of 1896, filing the final papers in the same land office where the clerk had looked at her as though she were holding a forgery. The clerk who took her papers that day was different, a younger man with a steady manner who looked at the documentation and recorded it without comment. She walked out of the land office into the April sun. She stood on the board sidewalk of Elk Creek and felt the warmth on her face. Direct and simple, the way the sun warms you in early spring, when it has come back from wherever it goes in winter and is not yet strong, but is present and climbing and on its way too strong. She had been 64 years old when she arrived. She was 67 now, and her hands were the hands of someone who had spent 3 years in this place and knew every way it could try to kill you and had found answers to most of them, and she planned to stay on the land until she could not stay anymore, which she privately believed would be quite some time. Nettie was 12. She had her mother's coloring and her father's serious eyes, and she had spent 3 years watching an old woman build things that people said could not be built, and this had given her a particular quality of attention, a habit of looking at problems the way you look at something you intend to understand rather than something you intend to give up on. That spring, on a warm afternoon when the snow had retreated to the high north slopes and the creek was running full with melt, Nettie found Edna at the cabin door sitting in the sun with a piece of mending in her lap. The child sat down beside her. After a while, she said, "Will you teach me how you figured it out?" Edna looked at the April light on the mountains above the timberline, the rock and snow, and the particular pale gold that high altitude gives to afternoon sun. She said, "I did not figure it out. The Romans figured it out 2,000 years ago. I only remembered it at 2 in the morning when I was too tired to remember anything else." Nettie thought about this. She said, "Oh, then will you teach me how to remember things like that?" Edna looked at the child beside her, the serious brown eyes and the calloused hands already at 12, the hands of someone who has been doing real work. She thought about this boarding house in Denver, in the book with the drawing of the Roman baths, and the caption she had read without knowing she was filing it somewhere she could find it later when the problem it answered arrived. "Knowledge does not know in advance what it will be needed for," she said. "You gather it because it is true, not because you know what it is for. And then one night when you are sitting on a cold floor in a mountain cabin and your child is going to freeze, if you cannot figure something out, it is there." Nettie sat with this. Then she said, "So I should read everything?" Edna said yes. She went back to her mending. The sun moved across the April sky in the slow arc of a season returning to itself. The creek ran bright and cold below the bench. The cabin stood solid on its foundation, the sod roof greening at the edges where the warmth was reaching it, the window catching light, the door open to the air. Below the floorboards, in the channels lined with river stone and sealed with creek clay, the earth held its temperature. Not dramatically, not visibly, just there doing what earth does at depth, holding steady against whatever the surface sent down to it, patient and constant and true. She had built a floor that worked. She had survived on river willow and creek stone, and a drawing in a book she had read once without knowing she would need it. She had proved up the land. She had stayed.